Good evening, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the P in IEP. We spoke at 8 a.m. this morning. We talked about 5 different very critical P's in IEP. I'm not going to be redundant tonight. If you are interested in that first part, it is archived on the business page. You can go back and you can listen to it. I have with me here tonight a very special guest, another veteran IEP advocate and Section 504 advocate, Ray Nelson. Ray, introduce yourself.
Hi, Ray Nelson, Nelson Advocacy. I've known Krista for years. We get along great. And we see eye to eye on a lot of things, which is nice.
It really is. So I'm looking forward to this chat. And so I invited Ray on because the next part of this conversation is in having to do with the presumption of competence. And then we'll go on to the very important discussion of the question of placement. Ray has his own personal story that touched me very deeply when it comes to presuming competence in students and children, in this case his own. But then he also has the diverse experience of not only having insight as a parent, but also as a IEP advocate sitting on so many IEP teams, not only in the state of Virginia, but also in other states. Ray, I would love to hear your portion on the presumption of competence, and thanks for being with us.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Krista. You know, I love doing this stuff with you. So let's talk a little bit about my story first. So I became an advocate. I have no history in education, right? I was in sales, finance, insurance. All of my history was in numbers. And then my son was diagnosed with autism at age 3.5. And I knew nothing about it, so I had to learn. But when we left, it was and I don't want to give the wrong impression here. The diagnostic team was wonderful, right? We went through Georgetown University hospitals, Autism and Communication Disorders Clinic. They were a wonderful team, but because of what the medical model is, they give you a diagnosis, which is what's wrong, and then they give you a prognosis, which is how it's going to go. So they told us what was wrong, and when they told us how it was going to go, I had some issues with it because they spell out kind of a doom and gloom scenario, right? Like your son will never be able to communicate. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, you know, because he has language difficulty. And I said, but language isn't the only way people communicate, right? We sing, we dance, we make art, we play music. There are a bunch of ways to communicate that don't have anything to do with talking. And so the speech language pathologist, who was very sweet, said, you know, I didn't think of it that way. You're correct. Let me limit my statement to say he won't be able to express himself verbally or orally very well. And I said, okay. I said, I can accept that, at least, you know, because you're a specialty. So when we left, of course, we had known that our son was autistic before we took him to be diagnosed. You know, we were on a wait list for 6 months, but seeing it in writing and hearing a bunch of people tell you that is very, very disheartening. And we got to the car, and my wife had cried probably 5 times in the meeting, and she was crying again as we're sitting in the car. And she said, does this mean that he'll never be able to do anything? And I said, you know, honey, they can't predict the future any better than we can. So I don't think it means anything. I was like, they gave us a roadmap of things to do. Let's do the things that they said to do and find other things that will help him. And each step along the way, and it's been a long ride, right? He's 18 now. We started this when he was 3.5. We actually started it before that, but the really heavy lifting started then. And every step along the way, people would tell us, well, he can't do this, right? And we would say, well, we don't believe you. And we would be nice about it, right? Because we're nice people, but we would say, we think he can do it. So before you tell us he can't, let's try and let's see if he can. And of course, he has always been able to do it, right? Because I get a lot of credit for this, but I feel like the credit really belongs to my son, right? He did the work. Me and my wife, we were just there pushing people to allow him to do the work, right? In some cases, like I remember when he was entering high school, and we talked to him, and he wanted to go for the advanced diploma, which is apparently unheard of in special education, which is crazy to me because a lot of people who have disabilities are very intelligent and should be given access to advanced learning, right? And the team said, I remember this was somebody high up in the school division said, well, he has language issues. shouldn't you avoid language? And I said, I think if he has language issues, you should add language, right? Like you get better at things the more that you do them. So wouldn't it make more sense to add a second language to increase his language skills? And they looked at me like I was speaking another, that I was speaking another language. Like, what is this guy saying? So just to give you sort of the outcome of all of this sustained advocacy for my son, right now he is a junior in high school. Now he is 18. We held him back 1 year. He is on track to graduate with an advanced studies diploma. He is in his second year of Spanish. He is an A student in Spanish. He's an A student in most of his classes. He has a GPA of 4.21. Half of his classes are collaborative, his core academics, and his other classes are general education students. Now, he has a lot of support. He has a one-to-one para. He has a speech therapist that is incredible. After school, he does an Orton Gillingham reading intervention that has made a huge difference in his ability to process language. But every step along the way, people told us no, and we just politely, kindly, firmly said, we need to give this a shot. And just doing that opened doors for him. So on the advocacy side, first of all, my wife and I bet all our chips on our son, right? So we're very happy to see that we bet on the right horse. You know what I mean? But on the advocacy side, because I've seen that success with my son, I advocate for that at the IEP table too. And I see this a lot, especially with kids who are nonverbal. People do not have the expectation that those children can succeed in any way, shape, or form. And I disagree vehemently when I see that at the table, because if the child is nonverbal, how are you measuring the child's skills, right? Like the big question that I have is how you have to prove to me, like for some reason, we do this backwards for kids with disabilities, right? Kids without disabilities, we automatically assume that they can do anything that they want. Kids with disabilities, we automatically assume that they can't do anything that they want, right? So some of it is sort of reframing the conversation to go, wait a minute, why don't we give this kid the same shot other kids get? But a lot of it too is, I find these cases with the kids who are nonverbal, they tell me the kids can't learn. And I'm like, the kid's using an iPad like no adult I've ever seen. So you see problem solving right there, right? Like the kid is problem solving. The kid knows how to get to the apps he wants to get to. He knows how to play the games he wants to play. And he's probably reading some of the text on the screen to tell him what to do. So you can't tell me that just because he can't speak, there's no language, right? Because language, as we learn from people who are deaf, right? Language can be sign language, or, writing can be braille, right? For people who are blind or vision impaired. So when I hear can't, that's a red flag to me, because I don't believe anybody can't. I don't believe there's a person that can't learn something, regardless of their age, regardless of their disability. And I also really, really fight to say, yes, the disability exists, but the disability itself is not a creation of an inability to do something, right? I have a disability. I have ADHD. It has not limited me significantly. And in fact, in many ways has been a blessing for me. Now, when I was younger, did I miss a lot of meetings? You're damn right I did, right? Because I was not good at keeping track of time. As an older adult now, I am good at keeping track of time. So when I think about disability, I think about that as just something that rounds out the person, right? Like I'm not just someone with ADHD. I'm someone with ADHD who has had a number of jobs and has a number of skills. My self-definition is not my disability. And I feel like school teams do a disservice to these kids by defining them by their disability. So I always push back on this idea that their disability limits them, because just because it's unconventional doesn't mean that it won't work, right? Just because it's a different approach doesn't mean that the knowledge is less. And I'll wrap up with one last little anecdote. So the most interesting thing in some of the scientific research that's come out especially since audiobooks have become so popular, there used to be this argument on the internet that, reading a book meant holding a book and reading it physically. Well, as somebody who's a veteran advocate, I know that's not true. I know that the kids that I have that are visually impaired get just as much information and knowledge from a Braille book or a book on tape as I do reading a conventional book, right? But now there are scientific studies that back that up. So any way that you can get kids to access and use language, hear stories, read books, they're going to benefit from it. So if you can just bring that to your IEP teams and push them to think differently about how these kids get educated and make them think first how to succeed before why it will fail, you'll have a lot more success. So I hope that covers what you wanted me to cover, Krista.
It totally does. That was incredible. I was touched by it myself. You had my attention the entire time.
Good.
And I know that it's a message that's going to leave a positive impact and imprint and forward action for not only parents, but every stakeholder at the IEP team. So I really thank you for that.
Well, thank you for letting me share it. And, you know, it's the more we assume that people can succeed, the more we'll assist them in succeeding. You know, that's the way that I think about it. The approach really is the difference.
Thank you so much, Ray.
Thank you, Krista. Well, I will talk to you soon. I have to go, but thank you for having me. I hope everybody has a great evening, and I hope everybody succeeds in whatever they're advocating for. Bye-bye.
Good night, Ray.
Good night.
Hi, everyone. So we're back, and that was just incredible. From here, we're going to go into the last P in our series, which is placement. The question of placement is, it's a huge one. It's one of the most argued points in an IEP team meeting. It's one of the reasons that parents call advocates like myself and Ray all the time. Sometimes it's because parents are wanting to change to a different placement, like a removal from the gen ed classroom, and they feel like that'll be better for their child. But oftentimes it's because a student, and their child in particular that's calling us, has been segregated from the general education population. We know that we need to educate students with disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate alongside their non-disabled peers. And we know through studies that the outcomes in doing that are manifold. And the outcomes are actually better outcomes educationally, socially, emotionally, and independent functioning, not only for the students that have disabilities, but also for typically developing peers. Why do we still have amongst many populations and the opinion of many educators and even some parents, this idea that in order to receive specialized instruction that we need to be in a separate setting? And how do we come together as an IEP team, parent and professionals included, our two Ps in the IEP team table, and make sure that we're considering the right set of variables and factors, and that we're going through the proper set of considerations when we determine the student's placement? I also want to preface all of this with saying to you that placement is not all or nothing. It does not mean that the student is either all day long in a general education class, never removed for any purpose, or alternatively in a self-contained ESE, depending on your school district and what they call it, special needs classroom all day long from the time that they come in to the time that they leave. Students and school districts are supposed to consider, alongside parents, the full continuum of service and placement options, which for some students might include simply 2 30-minute removals a week for language therapy, and the rest of this time that they spend in gen ed with a push-in ESE teacher that comes in. For other students, they might come out for math every day, and they're there in the classroom every other time for the rest of the subject area, recess, lunch, special areas. It's not so black and white as all or nothing. I have a course that I taught in the past called the Rule of Removal. And I feel like what we need to be doing when we go into planning our position about placement for a student is coming into that process clean slate, okay? Making a list of what we believe when we go through all of the students' present levels of performance, informal and formal. We interview, we take information from the parent, the student, if appropriate and possible, all professionals working with the student in and out of the school, and their current levels of ability and difficulty, okay? Make a list of what the student requires to be successful. It might be 15 things, it might be 3 things, it might be 20 things, whatever it is that they require to make meaningful educational progress and have access to meaningful educational benefit, which is the cornerstone of a free, appropriate public education. Whatever those things are, go down that list one by one and ask yourself, is this something that could be provided in a regular education classroom with exposure to non-disabled peers, or does it truly require a removal to receive? We shouldn't be considering things that have to do with just administrative convenience or master schedules or the limitations of one school. And by the way, this goes for parents too, because sometimes parents are in a school, whether it's a choice school or a charter or magnet school, that does not have the proper continuum to support their child in the regular education environment that would allow them to be with non-disabled peers. So if the parent is so committed to this one school that they're willing to allow for an inappropriate IEP or an unnecessary removal, then that also keeps us from going through this list of considerations with the proper care and concern for the student, even if we don't realize that that's what we're doing. So for instance, what are some of the most common reasons that I see that school teams say that a student needs to be removed? The most common reason by far is the need for a lower student to teacher ratio. I often argue that does not need to be done with only other children with disabilities. You could quite feasibly have a group of 6 or 7 children, 8 children, whatever it is, that have some that might have a disability, some that don't, that would benefit from the same instruction and skill, working with an ESC teacher at a kidney table, right? Or in a calming area of the classroom, they could be working on social skills. You don't need to remove to create a small group. Yes, the reality remains that there's 20 or 25 children in the same physical space, but there are a lot of things that you can do to make the physical space and environment more conducive. And we cannot always assume that that size is the only factor that we need to be considering here. Another factor is behavior. The impact of the student's behavior on themselves and the impact of the student's behavior on others. There are a lot of behavior interventions and remediation that could be done anywhere, right? In any setting. Now, if a student requires significant mental health assistance and needs to be hospitalized, obviously that's not a setting that can be replicated in a general education environment, but there are many things that we can do. So the rule of removal is that you really consider that question for each one of those points and you remove to the extent that's necessary for the benefit of the student. One thing that I want you to be aware of, and then I'm going to close the conversation out. We've had a lot of P's today, but one thing that I really want you to be aware of is that every time that you open up an annual IEP meeting, or if you request an amendment into a meeting and include the purpose of reconsidering placement, it should be discussed and it should be considered. And it should not just be, okay, now we're in the service and placement section and it's a copy paste of last year's, a replica of last year's services and placement without any discussion. And this is also where another P comes into place, which is parent input. And we've talked a lot about that in previous sessions. We'll talk a lot about that in future sessions. You need to stop the team and give your input. If you feel that instead of the 3 sessions that your child has been receiving, that they need to be pulled out for 5 sessions, or if you feel like they don't need to be pulled out anymore, they need a support person to come in to the general education classroom and support them right there without the removal. Don't just let them run through it like a laundry list. Have a discussion, ask questions, and go through these points of what the child needs, what truly requires a removal, and determine the placement to the standard that IDA says, to the maximum extent appropriate. Because really, guys, inclusion, it's all about belonging. It's all about personhood. It's all about our human experience and being a fabric in our community and in our schools. And it starts with our children. I'll tell you one last thing and then I'm going to go. I remember when I went to my own daughter's holiday show several years back. And these are wonderful people. All the school staff is wonderful people, but me in the role that I'm in and with the passion that I have for inclusivity, I'm sitting there and I'm seeing all of the children that are from the self-contained classroom that do music with my daughter on one side of the stage with the parapro who is hovering over them and micromanaging their every participation in the show. And then all the general education students in that grade level on the other side of the stage. And it made me feel uncomfortable. And I'm not even the parent of one of those children. And I know that it makes students uncomfortable, whether they can express that to us or not. So we need to do better. We need to be more purposeful. Sometimes it's just bringing an awareness to it, but we need to reconsider placement. You can have children with significant needs that might need to be in an ESE setting for certain parts of the day. There's no reason that they can't be included for some part of the day. There's no reason that they can't be sitting at an integrated table with support at lunch, or they can't play outside at the playground with other children of all kinds. We're all children. We're all members of the school. Thank you for joining me for the I in IEP, the E in IEP, the P in IEP, and today, 2 segments of the P in IEP. I invite you to like and follow this page for future free live coffee chats. I enjoy these so much, and I hope that you do too. And please, if you didn't watch this morning's session, it's archived and it's saved, and it was a really good one. I hope you'll watch and give me your questions and comments. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the night.